The church had been dressed for a wedding that would never happen. 200 white roses climbed the stone pillars of St. Margaret's Chapel in Ashford, England, their petals still trembling from the morning breeze that slipped through the arched windows. The pews were filled with the finest names in 3 counties, lords and ladies in summer silk, generals with iron chests of medals, widows who had known the Calloway family for 50 years. The organist played. The candles burned. And at the altar, in a charcoal morning coat with silver buttons, stood Devereux Calloway, the 6th Duke of Ashford, tall, square-jawed, and utterly alone. He had been standing there for 11 minutes. The congregation had stopped pretending not to notice. 11 minutes in a church, waiting for a bride who did not come, is not a delay. It is a declaration. Her name was Isolde Vane, and she had been the most talked about woman in Ashford society for the past 2 years. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she had managed to do something no woman in living memory had accomplished. She had made Devereux Calloway fall in love with her. Everyone said so. You could see it in the way he watched her across ballrooms, the way his voice dropped half a register when he spoke her name. Isolde Vane had arrived in Ashford from a crumbling manor house in Derbyshire with almost nothing to recommend her except a sharp mind, a proud spine, and the kind of quiet patience that made people underestimate her badly. She had accepted Devereux's proposal on a cold Thursday in February, and the whole county had exhaled as if a story they had been waiting for had finally reached its proper chapter. But Isolde was not here. The chapel doors were closed. The carriages outside were still. Someone in the 3rd pew whispered behind a gloved hand, and the whisper moved like smoke through the entire room. Devereux's best man, his younger brother Cassius, leaned close and murmured something. Devereux shook his head. He would not move from this spot. Not yet. His face was composed. That was the most terrible thing about it. He had the face of a man who had been expecting this, or perhaps the face of a man who had already died, standing up, and simply had not fallen. The priest stared at his scripture with the concentrated blankness of a man pretending he could not see what was directly in front of him. The roses kept swaying. A letter arrived at 12 minutes past 11. A footman carried it up the aisle on a small silver tray, his steps so careful they were almost silent. Devereux took it without expression, broke the wax seal, Isolde's seal, a simple pressed flower in burgundy, and read. No one in the church could hear what was in that letter, but they watched his face. They watched his jaw tighten once, only once, like a man biting down on something that would break a lesser jaw entirely. Then he folded the letter precisely in half, placed it in his breast pocket, and turned to the congregation. There will be no wedding today, he said. His voice was calm. It was the calmest voice anyone in that chapel had ever heard, and it was the most frightening thing they had ever heard. He walked down the aisle alone and did not look back. The letter was 11 lines long. It began, Devereux, by the time this reaches you, I will already be gone. I am not the woman you believe me to be, and you deserve to know that before we make a mistake that cannot be undone. It ended. I am sorry. I am not sorry enough to have done differently. That is the truest thing I know how to tell you. What Devereux did not tell anyone, not his brother, not his solicitor, not the red-faced earl who cornered him outside the chapel, demanding answers on behalf of the assembled guests, was that the letter contained something else. Tucked between the 2nd and 3rd page was a single legal document, a handwritten property claim. Isolde Vane was not simply leaving him. She was asking, formally, in ink, with her signature already applied, for the return of every property, every deed, and every asset she had brought into the betrothal agreement. She wanted it all back, and she had already engaged a solicitor to make it happen. The ride back to Ashford Hall was silent. Cassius sat opposite his brother and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone had done for Devereux all morning. The hall itself was dressed for a wedding breakfast, flowers in every corridor, champagne chilled in silver buckets, tables laid for 200. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penny, appeared at the door with the careful face of a woman who has received news she cannot process yet. Devereux walked past her, past the flowers, past the champagne, up the wide staircase and into his study. He locked the door. He sat down at his desk. He placed Isolde's letter in front of him and the property claim beside it, and he looked at both for a long time without moving. Then quietly, he opened a drawer and removed a separate document, one that Isolde did not know existed. His hands were steady, absolutely steady. Whatever grief was inside him was a private country, and no one was being admitted today. By nightfall, every drawing room in Ashford and beyond was humming with the story. The Duchess, who wasn't. The altar left empty. The extraordinary audacity of a woman who had not only refused to marry one of the most powerful men in England, but had done so by letter at the very last possible moment in front of 200 witnesses, and had then, impossibly, asked for her property back. Public opinion was volcanic and deeply divided. Half the county was furious on Devereux's behalf. The other half, particularly the women, particularly the younger ones, were doing something much more complicated. They were quietly, privately, a little bit electrified. Nobody spoke that part aloud, not yet. But it was there, in the pauses between sentences, in the way a few of them glanced at each other over their teacups. Somewhere in a rented room in the village of Threlwick, 14 miles east, Isolde Vane was sitting with her coat still on, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, watching the road outside the window, waiting, not for rescue, for what came next. 4 years before she walked away from the most important altar in Ashford, Isolde Vane had been folding other people's laundry. Not because she was a servant, she was not, but because Vane Hall in Derbyshire had run out of servants 3 winters ago, and her father's pride had run out of solutions, and someone had to make sure the linens were clean before the debt collectors arrived with their ledgers and their cold eyes. Isolde had 2 older brothers and a mother, who kept to her bedroom, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided that catastrophe was something that happened to other people if you simply refused to acknowledge it. Her father, Edmund Vane, was a gentle, brilliant, deeply impractical man who loved poetry and hated arithmetic, and had, over the course of 15 years, quietly signed away most of what the family owned. The Vane estate had not collapsed suddenly. It had thinned, the way cloth thins before it tears, slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you held it up to the light and saw straight through it. The horses went first, then the west wing, then the groundskeeper, then the cook, then the 2 parlor-maids who had been with the family since Isolde was born. What remained was the hall itself, mortgaged 3 ways, the east garden, which was dying, and 4 people who were all very carefully not talking about any of it. Isolde talked about it. She was the only one who did. She sat across from her father with his ledgers spread between them and said the words he could not say himself, that they were drowning, that they needed a plan, that something had to be done before the bank sent men with keys. Edmund Vane looked at his youngest child across those pages and said, "You have a remarkable mind, Isolde." And then he went back to reading Keats. She had taught herself the law from her grandfather's library, property law, estate law, the particular labyrinthine language of entailments and marriage settlements and dowry agreements. She had done this not because she had a plan, but because knowledge felt like the only solid floor in a house where every other surface had started to give. By 22, she could read a legal document faster and more accurately than most solicitors she had met. She had also, by necessity, become an expert in what women were and were not allowed to own, which was remarkably little, which was the thing that made her jaw tighten every time she sat down at those ledgers, because the Vane property that was being lost, piece by piece, was not only her father's to lose. Half of it had come from her mother's family, and her mother's family had signed it all away into her father's name, as women's families did, and now it was disappearing, and no one who had the legal power to stop it seemed to think that was worth stopping. She met Devereux Calloway at a funeral. This was not as strange as it sounds. Funerals were, in many ways, the most honest social events of the era. No one was performing quite as hard. Lord Ashmore, an old family friend, had died in October, and the gathering afterward at Ashford Hall had been subdued and decent, the kind of afternoon that moved slowly and smelled of cold stone and chrysanthemums. Devereux had been standing alone beside a window, which was where Isolde noticed him first, not because he was handsome, though he was, but because he was reading, at a funeral reception. He had a small book open in his palm, held low, and he was reading with the guilty speed of a man who had been caught and had decided not to care. Isolde had thought, there is someone who is also pretending to be somewhere else. She had felt, unexpectedly, a warmth toward him. They had spoken for 40 minutes. Not about the funeral, not about the weather, not about the social arrangements that were the standard currency of such events. They had spoken about water rights, specifically about a dispute between two tenant farmers on the Ashford estate that Devereux had been failing to resolve for 6 months. Isolde had read about a similar case in her grandfather's law books and had offered, offhandedly, a solution. Devereux had stared at her, not with the blank politeness of a man waiting for a woman to finish speaking so he could continue. He had stared at her with the focused, slightly startled expression of someone who had just been told the answer to a question they had been struggling with alone. That would actually work, he said. I know, said Isolde. And that was the beginning of everything, though neither of them would have called it that then. What followed was 18 months of something Isolde had not planned for. She had not planned to fall in love. She had come to Ashford with a very specific, very quiet purpose that had nothing to do with Devereux Calloway's feelings or her own. She had come because she had discovered, buried in her mother's old documents, a deed to a parcel of Derbyshire land that her mother had inherited before her marriage and which had never, despite her father's best efforts, been legally absorbed into the Vane estate. It was hers. It was technically and irrefutably hers, and it had been used, without her knowledge or permission, as collateral for a loan that connected, through 3 layers of financial arrangement, to a trust managed out of Ashford. Isolde had not come to marry. She had come to recover what was stolen. The falling in love had been an accident, the most expensive accident of her life. She had told him none of this. That was the weight she carried into every room they shared, the knowledge that her original reason for being in his world was not romantic. She had stayed because it had stopped being about the deed. She had stayed because of the way he listened, because of the water rights conversation that became dozens of other conversations, because of the morning he had ridden 12 miles in cold rain to bring her father a legal contact who might help with the Vane estate, and had done it without being asked and without telling anyone, and Isolde had found out by accident 3 weeks later. But the deed was still there. The injustice was still there. And on the night before the wedding, lying in the dark in the room prepared for her at Ashford Hall, she had understood with sudden, terrible clarity that if she married him in the morning, she would never be free to fix it. A wife could not sue her husband's estate. A wife could not hold independent legal standing against her own household. She would have to choose. She had chosen. She had not slept. Devereux Calloway had been managing grief his entire life, and he was very good at it. He had lost his father at 14, a brother at 19, and his first intended at 23. Not to death, but to a titled man with a larger estate. A common enough story, but it had left its mark. By 31, he had developed what his household staff privately called the stillness, a quality in him that was not coldness, not exactly, but a kind of deep internal steadiness, like a building whose foundations ran further into the ground than anyone could see. You could not tell from looking at him what was happening inside. This was, depending on who was looking, either his greatest strength or the thing that made people feel most alone in a room with him. He did not cancel the wedding breakfast. This was the detail that made Cassius stop dead in the hallway the morning after and simply stare. The flowers were still up. The tables were still laid. The champagne was still chilled. Devereux appeared at 9 o'clock, dressed as if it were an ordinary Thursday, sat at the head of the table, and ate breakfast. Cassius sat across from him and ate breakfast. Mrs. Penny served them in the careful silence of a woman who understood that certain things required no comment. No one else came down. No one was invited. There were 2 settings at a table made for 40, and Devereux ate methodically, without haste, and when he finished, he said, "I'll need the estate solicitor by 11, and went to his study. The solicitor's name was Mr. Aldrich Thorne, and he had served the Calloway family for 22 years. He arrived at 11 o'clock precisely, as requested, and was shown to the study by Mrs. Penny, who looked as though she had not slept. Devereux sat at the desk. He placed Isolde's property claim on the surface between them. "I need you to review this," he said. Aldrich Thorne sat down and put on his spectacles and read. When he was finished, he looked up. "Your Grace," he began carefully, "I need you to understand what you are looking at." "I know what I am looking at," said Devereux. "She has legal standing for the Derbyshire parcel. She does not have legal standing for the other 3 items." "That is my reading also." "Good," said Devereux. "Then we begin." The thing that surprised Aldrich, though he would not have said so, was that Devereux was not angry. He was very precise. He examined each item in Isolde's claim with the same focused attention he brought to estate management or the water rights cases his tenants brought him, and he separated what was legitimate from what was not with a clarity that was almost unsettling. The Derbyshire parcel, the original deed from Isolde's mother's family, he set to one side immediately. "She is right about this one," he said. "Arrange for the transfer." Aldrich blinked. "Your Grace, there is an argument to be made." "I know what arguments can be made. Arrange for the transfer." He moved to the next item, and the next. Aldrich Thorne would say later to his wife that he had been a solicitor for 22 years, and he had never seen a man respond to being left at the altar by conducting a property review. He was thorough, Aldrich told her. He was the most thorough I have ever seen him. The property that Isolde had listed in her claim was not random. Aldrich could see that now that he looked. She had identified exactly the right items, the things that genuinely should have remained in her name, the things that had slipped into the betrothal agreement through mechanisms that were, on reflection, not entirely sound. She had done legal research, considerable legal research. Aldrich found himself doing a calculation he had not expected to be doing in this meeting. This woman knew property law. He said so, carefully, to Devereux. "I am aware," said Devereux. There was a pause. "How long have you been aware?" Aldrich asked. Devereux looked out the window at the wedding roses, still climbing the garden wall. "A while," he said, which told Aldrich nothing and everything simultaneously. That evening, a reply was sent to Isolde Vane's solicitor in Threlwick. It was not the reply anyone expected. It did not contest the claim. It did not threaten legal action. It acknowledged the Derbyshire parcel immediately and confirmed the transfer would be completed within 10 days, as Isolde had requested. For the remaining items on her list, Devereux's letter offered a detailed legal response, not aggressive, not dismissive, but point by point, thorough and fair, noting which claims had standing and which did not, and offering to have the disputed items reviewed by a neutral party, if Isolde preferred. At the bottom of the letter, below the signature, was one additional line, not dictated to Aldrich, written in Devereux's own hand. Aldrich had not read it before it was sealed, which was unusual, and which he thought about on the ride home. He did not ask what it said. Cassius found his brother in the garden at dusk, standing near the rose wall. The wedding flowers were still up and would stay up, Devereux had decided, until they died naturally, because taking them down would be a performance of feeling, and Devereux had made a private decision not to perform. "You gave her the parcel," Cassius said, "not a question. She was right about it. You could have fought it. I could have." Devereux looked at the roses. The last of the evening light was turning them amber at the edges. "That is not what this is." "Then what is it?" Cassius asked. Devereux was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She spent 2 years here trying to get back something that belonged to her family. She built a life here, a real one. She made friends here. She sat with Father's portrait and told me things about estate management I had not thought of in 15 years of running this place." He paused. "She was wrong to lie. She was not wrong about the land." Cassius looked at his brother for a long time. "Are you in love with her?" "That," said Devereux, "is not the relevant question right now." He walked back toward the house. The roses moved behind him in the evening wind. Threlwick was the kind of village that kept its business to itself. 14 miles from Ashford, pressed between a river and a low chalk hill, it had one inn, one church, one general store that also served as the post office, and the kind of collective silence that small places develop when outsiders begin to appear too frequently. Isolde had been here 3 days. She had taken a room above the inn under a false name, Miss Evelyn Marsh, and she had barely left it, because leaving it meant being seen, and being seen meant people would ask questions she was not ready to answer. She had eaten half a loaf of bread and drunk too much tea and spent most of her time sitting with her knees pulled up on the small window seat, watching the road below with the steady, unblinking attention of someone waiting for an outcome they cannot control. Her solicitor, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Pemberton from the town of Luton, had taken the case because the legal argument was clear and because Isolde had laid it out for him with a precision that had made him sit back in his chair and regard her with open respect. "You have done this work yourself," he had said. "Most of it," she had told him. He had agreed to represent her on the condition that she understood what she was doing, not legally, which she understood better than most, but personally. "This is Devereux Calloway," he had said. "Yes," she had replied. "I know." What she had not told Mr. Pemberton was that she had also left something behind in Ashford that had nothing to do with property. She had left the drawing room, where she had spent 100 evenings in quiet conversation. She had left the East Library. She had left a man who had ridden 12 miles in cold rain to help her father without being asked. The reply from Devereux's solicitor arrived on the 4th morning. Pemberton brought it to her room in person, which meant it was significant. He sat in the one chair by the small table and read it aloud while Isolde sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap. She kept her face still while he read. She had learned stillness from Devereux, she realized distantly, or perhaps she had always had it, and he had simply given it a name. Pemberton reached the part about the Derbyshire parcel and stopped, looked up. "He is conceding it immediately," he said. "I know," said Isolde. "How do you know?" She said nothing. He continued reading. When he reached the disputed items and the offer of neutral review, he set the letter down on the table and looked at her for a moment. "This is a fair response," he said. "It is an exceptional response," she said. The handwritten line at the bottom was not addressed to Pemberton. It was addressed to her by name, which meant Devereux had known she would be here, at this solicitor, in this approximate place, which meant he had known or guessed more than she had thought. The line read, "The deed was always yours. Come and get it yourself if you are willing. I have no interest in making this a war." Isolde read it 3 times. Then she folded the letter precisely in half, the same way Devereux had folded hers in the chapel, and placed it in her coat pocket. She said to Mr. Pemberton, "I will need a few days." He looked at her carefully. "Miss Vane, I know what I am doing," she said. And the complicated thing was that she believed it, and at the same time she was not entirely sure it was true, and the difference between those two states of mind had been the weather of her entire life. She walked to the river that afternoon. The Threlwick River was narrow and dark, cutting between willow roots and pale chalk banks, running fast and cold even in June. Isolde stood on the wooden bridge above it and thought about the Derbyshire parcel, that strip of land on a hillside she had never seen, that had belonged to her grandmother, that her mother had inherited and never thought to protect, that had been used as a debt instrument without anyone asking if that was right or legal or fair. It was land. It was just land. It was 12 acres of pasture and 2 of woodland and 1 small cottage that had sat empty for 30 years. It was worth almost nothing in financial terms, but it was the first piece of solid ground her mother had ever owned in her own name, and they had taken it without asking, and that was the thing Isolde could not let go of. That was the stone she had carried for 2 years. That was what had brought her to Ashford, and it was what had kept her there far longer than she had planned. The problem with Devereux, the real problem, the one she lay awake with, was that he was not what she had come there expecting to find. She had expected a man who would be convenient and manageable, a powerful name she could navigate around while pursuing her real aim. She had not expected someone who asked real questions and then listened to the actual answers. She had not expected someone who said less than he meant and meant far more than he said, and who had, on one quiet autumn evening, looked at her across a dinner table and said, with no preamble and no particular performance, "You are the most capable person in this house, including me, and I think you know it." She had not expected that. She had not had a response prepared. That was the most disorienting thing about it. She, who prepared for everything, had not had a response. On the 5th day in Threlwick, she wrote 2 letters. The first was to her mother, who did not know where she was, explaining what she had done and why, and asking, not for permission, because she was past asking permission, but for understanding. The second letter she stared at for 40 minutes before writing. It was to Devereux. It was not long. It said she had received his response and found it fair, and that she was grateful for the Derbyshire concession, and that she had questions about the remaining items that she believed deserved a face-to-face conversation rather than a legal exchange conducted through intermediaries. She said she was willing to come to Ashford Hall if he was willing to receive her as a guest, not as a defendant, not as a petitioner, but as a person with legitimate claims and legitimate reasons for having made the choices she had made. She ended it. I am not asking to undo what I have done. I am asking to explain it properly. She sealed it before she could reconsider. She had made worse decisions with more hesitation. Ashford Village knew she was coming before she arrived. That was simply the nature of small communities and enclosed social worlds. Information moved faster than horses, and Isolde's carriage had been seen at the crossroads by the Hartley boy, who told his mother, who told 3 neighbors, who each told 3 more. By the time Isolde's hired carriage turned through the stone gates of Ashford Hall, the entire household staff had quietly repositioned themselves in ways that allowed clear views of the front drive without being obvious about it. Mrs. Penny stood at the main entrance as she always did. She had not been told to. She had simply decided she would be there. Isolde descended from the carriage in a dark blue traveling dress. No jewelry, except her mother's small garnet earrings, her brown hair pinned back plainly. She looked exactly as she always had. She looked like someone who had decided something. Devereux received her in the East Library, not the drawing room, not the formal parlor, not any of the rooms that carried the specific weight of social performance. The East Library was where they had spent most of their best evenings. The room with the low shelves and the wide desk, and the 2 armchairs angled toward the fireplace that someone had started even though it was June and too warm for fire, and which Isolde recognized immediately as a choice made by a man who wanted the room to feel like itself, rather than like a statement. Devereux stood when she entered. He was in a plain dark coat, no morning dress, no formality. He looked like himself. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. They stood at a distance of 8 feet and regarded each other with the careful attention of 2 people who had been thinking about this moment for days. "Before we discuss the legal matter," Isolde said, "I owe you an explanation." "You do not owe me anything," Devereux said. "You disagree with my choices. That is different from owing." "I disagree with your method," he said, which is a more specific and more honest thing to say. She almost smiled. Almost. She sat in one of the armchairs without being invited, which was the kind of thing she had always done in this room, and he sat in the other one. And for a moment, the library was simply the library. The smell of old paper and beeswax, the soft light through the tall windows, the particular quality of silence that this room had always had. Isolde said, "The Derbyshire parcel was my mother's inheritance. It was used as collateral without her knowledge, without legal notice, and without any mechanism by which she or I could recover it, because it had been signed into my father's name at marriage, and my father had no ability to manage it responsibly." She kept her voice level. "I came to Ashford to recover it." "I know," said Devereux. She looked at him. "How long have you known?" "Since approximately your 4th month here," he said. "Aldrich identified the connection when he was reviewing the estate trust records. He brought it to me." "And you said nothing?" "And I said nothing," Devereux agreed. His voice was even, unhurried, carrying no accusation. "Because by that point I was occupied with other things, and because I hoped you would simply tell me." Isolde looked at the fire. The room was very warm now. "I could not tell you," she said quietly, "because telling you meant choosing between the land and what we had become, and I could not see a path where I recovered one without losing the other." "You could have asked me," Devereux said. "I am not unreasonable." "I know you are not unreasonable," Isolde said. "I know that." A pause. "That is precisely why it was so difficult." They spent 4 hours in the East Library. It was not a negotiation exactly. It was something harder and more necessary than that. Isolde laid out the full history of the Derbyshire parcel, with the precision of someone who has rehearsed a speech and then abandoned the rehearsal entirely, speaking plainly instead. Devereux listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had never managed to prepare for. The quality of his attention, the way he did not simply wait for his turn to speak, but actually absorbed what she was saying and let it change the shape of his thinking in real time. When she finished, he said, "You were right about the deed. You were right about 3 of the 4 items on your list. The 4th is genuinely disputed, and I think you know it." "I listed it because I wanted the conversation," she said. "I know," he said again. They looked at each other. Devereux said very quietly, "Why did you not trust me enough to simply tell me?" Isolde said just as quietly, "I trusted you more than I have trusted anyone. That was the problem." She stayed for dinner. This was not planned. It happened because the conversation had not finished, and because neither of them stood up when the clock in the hall struck 7, and because Mrs. Penny appeared at the door with the careful expression of a woman who had made a unilateral decision and was informing her employer about it after the fact. "I have taken the liberty of setting 2 places in the small dining room, Your Grace," she said. Devereux looked at Isolde. Isolde said nothing, but did not move from her chair, which was answer enough. Mrs. Penny disappeared. They moved to the small dining room and ate a quiet meal that bore no resemblance to the wedding breakfast that had sat on these tables 11 days ago. Cassius appeared halfway through the soup, stopped in the doorway when he saw Isolde, processed this information with visible effort, said, "Good evening," and continued walking. Isolde appreciated this enormously. After dinner, they walked in the east garden, because the library had begun to feel too enclosed, and the night outside was soft and warm, and Devereux had said, "The roses are still up. I thought you might like to see them." They walked between the white rose pillars in the late summer dusk, and the flowers were fading now, edges going brown, petals beginning to loosen, but they still filled the air with something sweet and heavy. Isolde reached out and touched one without thinking. "I did not want to hurt you," she said. It was not the same as an apology. It was more honest than an apology. "I know," Devereux said for the 3rd time that day. "The hurt is not the thing I cannot understand. The silence is the thing." She nodded. She had no defense for the silence, because the defense was the same as the reason, and she had already given him the reason. She said, "What do you want, Devereux? Not legally. What do you actually want?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the last of the evening sky turning rose-colored over the garden wall. "That," he said, "is a question that deserves more than a garden conversation. Will you come back tomorrow?" Isolde looked at him. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. By the 2nd visit, the lawyers had entered the room. Not literally. Aldrich Thorne and Mr. Pemberton were at separate offices 14 miles apart, exchanging documents by messenger. But their presence was felt in the careful way Isolde and Devereux had started choosing their words, pulling back from the loose, honest speech of the library into the more guarded language of people who had been advised to be cautious. It was Isolde who noticed it first. On the 3rd morning, sitting across from Devereux at the East Library desk with a stack of documents between them, she set down her pen and said, "We are speaking to each other as if we are preparing to give depositions." Devereux looked up. A pause. "We are," he said. "Yes," she said. "I find it extremely tedious." He almost smiled. "As do I." "Then let us stop," she said, and pushed the documents to one side, and the conversation shifted into something more real. The 4th item on her list, the one Devereux had called genuinely disputed, was a small parcel of woodland on the Ashford estate boundary. It had been included in Isolde's betrothal settlement by her father's solicitor as part of what was intended to be a demonstrative transfer, a gesture of goodwill, the kind that was made in marriage negotiations to show the bride's family was engaging seriously. The problem was that it had not been Isolde's to give. Her father had believed it was an unencumbered family asset. It was not. It had a separate claim on it, quiet and old, from her mother's brother's estate, a claim that had been in legal suspension for 12 years because no one had pressed it. Isolde had found it in her grandfather's papers the same winter she had found the Derbyshire deed. She had listed it not because she could legally win it back, but because she needed someone to acknowledge it had been improperly transferred. "I do not want the woodland," she said to Devereux. He had read the relevant document twice now. "Then what do you want?" "I want it acknowledged," she said, "in writing, that the transfer was made on incorrect terms, that my father's solicitor failed to conduct proper research, that this is not simply," she paused, steadying herself, "that this is not simply a pattern of my family's assets being shuffled around by men who did not think to ask whether the woman whose name was on the deed had been told about it." Devereux was quiet. He was looking at the document, not at her, with the focused stillness of a man processing something that carried more weight than property law. Then he said, "Is this about your mother?" A silence. Isolde said, "This has always been about my mother." She said it the way you say a thing you have never said aloud, carefully, with the specific precision of someone reaching down and bringing up something they have kept very deep. What Isolde told him about her mother was not in any legal document. It was the story behind the documents, the story of a woman who had come into her marriage with 3 properties, 2 of which were her own inheritance, and had spent 20 years watching them erode through a series of decisions she had not been consulted on and had not been empowered to stop. Her mother's retreat to the bedroom had not been weakness, or not only weakness. It had been the particular kind of despair that comes from spending years attempting to assert yourself in a system that has carefully and thoroughly removed every mechanism by which you might do so. She knew, Isolde said, about all of it. She knew the parcel was her grandmother's. She knew the deed was there. She could not do anything about it herself, so she stopped looking at any of it. Devereux listened to all of this. Then he said, "And you looked at it for her?" "Yes," said Isolde. "She did not say, and then I fell in love with you, and nearly lost everything she gave me to find. She did not say it because she thought he might already know." The letter of acknowledgement was drafted that afternoon. Aldrich Thorne wrote 3 versions, each more legally precise than the last, and Devereux approved the third with modifications. The document acknowledged that the woodland transfer had been made on the basis of incomplete research by the parties representing the Vane estate, and that the underlying claim from Isolde's maternal uncle's estate had not been properly disclosed or accounted for. It did not award the woodland to anyone. It simply acknowledged the fact. It acknowledged the history. It put the failure in writing where it could be read, and if necessary, acted upon. Isolde held the final version in both hands and read it twice, standing at the library desk, and did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "This is more than I thought you would give." "It is simply accurate," Devereux said. "The history is what it is. Writing it down does not change it." "Writing it down does not change it," Isolde agreed. "But it means my mother will be able to read it. That changes something." The news that Isolde had returned to Ashford Hall traveled through the county as news always did, imperfectly, with embellishment ahead of the facts. By the 5th day of her visits, 3 separate versions of the story were in active circulation. In the first, Isolde had come to beg forgiveness and been refused entry. In the second, she had come to collect her belongings under armed escort. In the third, whispered in drawing rooms, repeated over tea with the careful casualness of something people wanted to be true. She had come back because she and Devereux had reached some kind of understanding, and something between them was being negotiated that had nothing to do with property at all. Lady Carmichael, who was 74 and had known Devereux's grandmother, said at dinner, "The Calloway men have always had terrible instincts about everything except the one thing that matters most." No one asked her to elaborate. Cassius found Isolde in the kitchen garden on the 6th morning, which was where she had always gone when she needed to think and could not sit still anymore. She was examining the state of the espaliered apple trees along the south wall, genuinely examining them, running her hand along the branches with the practical attention of someone who knows what she's looking at. He leaned against the wall and said nothing for a moment. Isolde said, "The left half of the 3rd tree has apple canker. Someone needs to tell the gardener." "I will pass it on," said Cassius. A pause. "You are still here." "I am," she said. "Does that bother you?" He considered this. "No," he said, "though I reserve the right to be bothered later, depending on how things resolve." "That is very reasonable," said Isolde. She straightened and looked at him directly. "He is not going to forgive me for the way I did it. I know that." "He might," said Cassius. "He is more flexible than he looks." "He is also more hurt than he shows," she said. Cassius was quiet. "Yes," he said, "he is that too." On the 7th day of Isolde's presence at Ashford Hall, her presence having at some point transitioned from visit to something less easily categorized, Devereux's mother arrived. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford, whose name was Constance Calloway, and whose personality was somewhere between a weather front and a very well-dressed siege engine, had been in Bath when the wedding collapsed. She had returned to London. She had spent a week there consulting with her own solicitor, her oldest friend, and the one cousin she trusted. Then she had come to Ashford. She had not written ahead. Constance Calloway did not write ahead. She arrived. The carriage came up the drive at 2:30 on a Thursday, and Devereux, who had been in the estate office with Isolde reviewing a map of the Derbyshire parcel, heard the wheels and looked up. He said, "Ah," Isolde said. "Your mother?" He said, "Yes." They both looked at the map for another moment, then put it down. Constance Calloway was 61, with a face like a portrait of itself and the posture of a woman who had decided decades ago that gravity was a suggestion. She came into the entrance hall and kissed her son on the cheek, and then turned and regarded Isolde with the full, uninterrupted attention of a woman who had been thinking about this moment in detail. Isolde met her gaze without flinching. This had been the correct approach with Constance 2 years ago, and it remained the correct approach now. "Miss Vane," said the Dowager. "Your Grace," said Isolde. A pause of approximately 4 seconds that contained roughly 40 unspoken sentences. Then Constance said to Devereux, "I will want tea, and then Miss Vane and I will speak privately if she is agreeable." "I am agreeable," said Isolde. Devereux looked between them with the expression of a man watching 2 ships maneuver in close water. He went to arrange the tea. They sat in the morning room, which was Constance's room, the one she had redecorated in 1887 and which still bore her taste entirely: pale yellow walls and dark wood, and the specific arrangement of furniture that meant conversations in this room were always direct. Constance poured the tea herself, which meant she wanted the control of the ritual. Isolde waited. "I am not here to be angry with you," Constance said, handing her a cup. "I have done my anger in Bath. It is finished." "I am glad," Isolde said, and meant it. "I am here," Constance continued, "because I want to understand something that my son will not tell me." "What does he tell you?" "Almost nothing," said Constance. "He tells me the property matter is being resolved. He tells me you have returned to discuss it in good faith. He does not tell me why you left, or what you were actually after, or why a woman with your intelligence made the choices you made." She set down her cup. "I find incomplete information intolerable," Isolde told her. "All of it. The deed, the mortgage, her mother's history, the legal research, the reason she had come to Ashford in the first place." She told it without softening or strategic omission, because Constance Calloway was exactly the kind of person you had to tell the truth to, or you were wasting everyone's time, including your own. The Dowager listened with the focused stillness of someone who has conducted important conversations for 40 years and knows the difference between what someone is saying and what they are actually saying. When Isolde finished, there was a pause. Constance said, "Your mother knew about the deed." "Yes." "And she never acted on it herself." "She had no mechanism to act." Constance was quiet. Then she said in a different voice, quieter, more private, "I am familiar with that situation." Isolde looked at her. "Yes," said Constance. "I thought you might be." What the Dowager Duchess told Isolde in the next half hour was not common knowledge. It was the history of the Calloway estate in a version that had never appeared in any legal document. The version where a young Constance had arrived at Ashford as a bride in 1863 and had found the accounts in complete disorder, the tenant farms barely solvent, and 2 mortgages she had not been told about before the wedding. She had spent the first decade of her marriage reconstructing the estate's financial stability, while her husband, a charming and brilliant man who was excellent at foreign policy and catastrophic at accounting, continued to represent the family in Parliament. She had done this work without acknowledgement, without credit, and without the legal standing that would have allowed her to put her name on any of the documents that resulted from it. "The estate you see now," she said, "is mine as much as his. It is not named mine anywhere. You understand?" "Yes," said Isolde. "I understand exactly." They finished the tea. Constance sat for a moment looking at her hands, then looked up. "My son," she said carefully, "is a better man than his father was. He has his father's ability to care deeply and his mother's ability to keep his counsel, and he has spent the last week doing something I recognize, which is conducting himself with absolute propriety on the outside while trying to work out something extremely complicated on the inside." "I know," said Isolde. "He is considering something," said Constance. "He has not yet decided. I think he is waiting to see whether you are here because of the land or because of something else." A pause. "I am here because of both," Isolde said. "The land was my reason for coming. What happened after is the reason I came back." "Is that a distinction that makes sense?" Constance asked. "It is the only honest answer I have," said Isolde. The dowager looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Then I suggest," she said, "that you tell him that in precisely those words." She stood. "Now, while he is still in the estate office and has not yet had time to build a wall around it." Isolde found Devereux in the estate office, which was where Constance had predicted. He was standing at the window that looked onto the north field, one hand on the frame, not reading anything, not working, just standing. She said his name. He turned. She said, "Your mother has advised me to be direct with you." He almost laughed. The same almost laugh she had seen 100 times in 2 years. The one that was really the closest thing to softness he allowed himself. "She would," he said. "She is right," said Isolde. She stood in the doorway and said, "I came to Ashford because of the land. I stayed, and I am still here now, because of you." Both of those things are completely true. Both of those things shaped every decision I made, including the wrong ones. I am not asking you to forget the wrong ones. I am asking you to believe that they were not the whole of it. Devereux looked at her. The afternoon light was coming through the north window, laying itself across the floor in long pale lines. He said, "I have never doubted that." She said, "Then what are we doing?" He said, "I think we are figuring out what comes next." "Good," said Isolde. She stepped into the room. "Let's figure it out." The county was not going to let this pass without comment. This was Ashford, where the Calloway name had been synonymous with social order for 4 generations, and the events of the past 3 weeks had been absolutely unprecedented in living memory. The wedding that didn't happen, the letter at the altar, the property claim, the return, the legal negotiations conducted as if by 2 people who were actually quite evenly matched, which was itself deeply unusual. The conversations happened in layers, at dinner tables, at morning calls, in letters between households, in the loaded silences of card parties where everyone was thinking about it and no one was quite willing to say it directly. What people kept returning to without being able to frame it properly was that Isolde had done something no woman in their social world had done before, and she had done it with evident competence, and Devereux had responded with evident fairness, and neither of those things fit the story people knew how to tell. The complication arrived in the form of a letter from Isolde's father. Edmund Vane had learned about his daughters, returned to Ashford through the family solicitor, who had heard from Pemberton, and he had written immediately, not to Isolde, which would have been the appropriate address, but to Devereux. The letter was 3 pages long and alternated between apology, justification, and a kind of oblique appeal that was trying very hard not to be an appeal. Edmund was sorry. Edmund had not known the full extent of the irregularities in the betrothal documentation. Edmund was grateful for the fair handling of the property matter. Edmund hoped that the situation between his daughter and his Grace might yet be resolved in a manner that was satisfactory to all parties. Devereux read it once, set it on the desk, and went to find Isolde. He showed her the letter. She read it standing at the estate office desk, and he watched her face move through the specific landscape of a person encountering something they have long understood but have never seen written down. "He is asking you to take me back," she said. Obliquely, Devereux agreed. "Without asking me," she said. Yes. She set the letter down. This is exactly... She stopped, breathed. This is exactly what he has always done. Made decisions about my life in my absence, with my best interests as the reason, without it occurring to him to ask what I thought my best interests were. I know, said Devereux. Are you going to respond to him? I am going to respond to him, she said, but I am going to tell you what I intend to write before I write it, because it involves both of us and you deserve to know first. She looked at him directly. That is what I should have done from the beginning. Told you first. I know that. He said nothing, but something in his face shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened, the way a window opens, letting in air. The response to Edmund Vane was written that evening in the East Library. Isolde wrote it and read it aloud to Devereux, who listened and offered one edit, which she accepted, and who found this process, two people reviewing a letter to her father together in the room that had always been theirs, so unexpectedly natural that it required a conscious effort not to remark on it. The letter told Edmund that the property matters were being handled between Isolde and Devereux directly, as they should be. It told him that his apology was accepted, and that she did not hold the failures of documentation against him personally, but that she needed him to understand what those failures had meant for her mother, and that she intended to discuss this with him in person when she returned to Derbyshire. It did not address the question of what her future relationship with Devereux might be. That, Isolde said, is not his business yet. Or ever, Devereux said, unless you choose to make it so. She looked at him. You sound like your mother. I have been compared to worse people, he said. The disputed fourth item, the woodland, had been generating quiet legal correspondence for 10 days. What emerged, as both solicitors dug deeper, was something neither had anticipated. The dormant claim from Isolde's maternal uncle's estate was not simply a claim. It was a properly filed document that had been sitting in a registry in Derbyshire for 12 years, waiting to be activated. Someone, Aldrich could not yet determine who, had known it was there, and had arranged the betrothal documentation carefully enough that the claim had not been flagged during initial review. The transfer had not been an accident. It had been designed to appear like one. Aldrich brought this to Devereux on a Friday morning with the careful gravity of a solicitor delivering news he cannot entirely account for. Devereux read the relevant document. Then he said very quietly, "Who drew up the original transfer?" "Your father's previous solicitor," Aldrich said, "Mr. Holcroft, who is retired." "I know Mr. Holcroft," Devereux said. "Find out who instructed him." Isolde was in the kitchen garden when Devereux came to find her at noon. She could tell by the way he was walking, not hurried, but purposeful in a different way than usual, that something had changed. He told her what Aldrich had found. She listened without interrupting. Then she sat down on the low stone bench beside the apple trees and was quiet for a moment. "Someone did this deliberately," she said. "It appears so," said Devereux. "For what purpose?" "Unknown as yet. Aldrich is investigating." She looked up at him. "This is bigger than the deed." "Yes. This is about the Ashford estate, about what is held in that trust, about something someone wanted to keep away from both our families." "That is my current reading," he said. He sat down beside her on the bench, which was unusual. Devereux did not sit on garden benches, and looked at the apple trees. "I owe you an apology," he said. She turned to look at him. He did not often say those words. "The reason I said nothing when Aldrich identified the connection 4 months ago," he said, "was that I had already decided to address it after the wedding, when you would have had legal standing as my wife. I thought I was being helpful." He paused. "I was managing the situation without asking you." "Yes," she said. "You were." "I was doing exactly what your father did," he said, in a better-intentioned version, but structurally the same. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You were." He nodded. "I am sorry." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. That evening, Cassius found them both in the estate office, working. Isolde at the desk with the property documents, Devereux standing at the wall map marking something with a pencil, talking without looking up, Isolde responding without looking up. The easy shorthand of people who have spent years thinking alongside each other. Cassius stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen and told Mrs. Penny that in his personal opinion, the East Wing guest rooms should be prepared for longer occupancy, because Miss Vane appeared to be in the middle of something and it would be unkind to rush her. Mrs. Penny looked at him over her spectacles and said she had already done so on the third day. Cassius nodded. "Right," he said. "Good?" He went to bed. It took Aldrich Thorne 4 more days to find the name. He found it in a secondary letter, buried in the files of the retired solicitor Mr. Holcroft, which Holcroft's former clerk had preserved with the particular conscientiousness of a man who suspects something wrong has occurred but does not yet know what to do about it. The letter was dated 11 years ago. It was from a man named Gerald Ashby, the same family whose son had been Cecily Vane's failed engagement target, as it happened, though the connection was not immediately apparent. The letter instructed Holcroft to include the Ashford woodland parcel in any future Calloway betrothal documentation as a demonstrative asset, with the specific intention of activating the dormant claim from the Vane maternal estate once the marriage was formalized, which would have then allowed Ashby to press the claim himself through a proxy. The Calloway woodland was worth very little. What lay beneath it, a strip of mineral-rich subsoil, registered in no public document, was worth a great deal more. Aldrich brought this to Devereux at 7 in the morning. Devereux read the letter, sat with it, read it again. Then he looked up and said, "He has been waiting 11 years. "Waiting for the right match," Aldrich confirmed. The previous solicitor was changed before the previous engagement. This was the first negotiation since then. "So when Isolde and I—" The arrangement was precisely what Ashby needed. The transfer would have happened on the wedding day. The legal mechanism would have activated upon the marriage certificate being registered. Devereux was quiet. Then he said, "Send for Mr. Pemberton as well. Miss Vane needs to hear this today." Aldrich nodded. "There is one other thing," he said. He produced a second document. "Ashby has a cousin who is currently a sitting magistrate in Derbyshire. He would have been very difficult to challenge." "Would have been," said Devereux, "past tense, because this letter exists." "Because this letter exists," Aldrich confirmed. They told Isolde at 9 o'clock in the East Library, with both solicitors present. Pemberton arrived by carriage from Luton at 8:30, having been sent an urgent message the previous evening. Isolde sat in her usual chair. Devereux sat across from her. They were flanked by their respective legal representatives, which was both formally appropriate and privately absurd, because what was happening had long since moved past the point where it was only a legal matter. Isolde read Gerald Ashby's letter in full. She read it twice. When she set it down, her face was very still, the stillness of someone processing something large and cold that has just resolved a long confusion. "He used my engagement," she said, not as a question. "Yes," said Devereux. "He waited for me to become engaged to you specifically," she said, "because the combination of the Vane maternal claim and the Calloway woodland gave him exactly the legal mechanism he needed." "Yes," she looked up. "And my leaving—" "Stopped him," said Devereux. "The transfer never occurred. He has no legal standing now." The silence that followed lasted approximately 10 seconds and was filled with a great deal. Then Isolde said, "I inadvertently protected the Ashford estate by walking out of that chapel." Pemberton coughed. Aldrich studied his documents. Devereux looked at Isolde across the library table with the expression of a man confronting something that was both extremely serious and, in its specific shape, something only the two of them would fully appreciate the dimensions of. "You did," he said. "Without knowing," she said. "Without knowing," he agreed. A pause. "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to discuss this." "I think," said Devereux, "that we have been discussing it for 3 weeks." She said, "I mean the other part, the part that is not the property." Pemberton and Aldrich both found simultaneous reasons to step outside. The door closed behind them with the quiet tact of 2 professional men who were very good at reading a room. What Devereux said to Isolde in the East Library, with the solicitors gone and the fire low and the morning light coming in across the map of Derbyshire still open on the desk between them, was not the speech of a man who had been rehearsing. It was shorter and more specific than speeches usually are. He said, I am going to tell you the thing I did not say in the garden, because I should have said it then, and I let the moment pass, which was the wrong choice. She looked at him. He said, I spent 2 years in conversation with you that I would not trade for anything I have. Not the title, not the estate, not the reputation, none of it. And I know that the foundation of those 2 years included a purpose of yours that predated me. And I know that complicated things in ways I cannot entirely unknot. And I know that you made decisions I would not have chosen. And I also know, he stopped for a moment, I also know that the person who sat with me in this room 100 evenings, who told me the truth about my tenants and my accounts and my own blind spots, who went to find my brother when he was in trouble without being asked, who examined the canker on the apple trees rather than walking past them, that person was entirely real. That was not a performance for a purpose. That was you. Isolde looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Yes. Just that. Yes. He said, I would like you to stay. She said, I was hoping you would say that. Gerald Ashby received a visit from Aldrich Thorne and a Derbyshire barrister the following Tuesday. The meeting was brief. The letter was shown. Ashby had enough legal intelligence to understand immediately what he was looking at and what it meant. The conversation that followed was not recorded, but what emerged from it was a signed document in which Ashby formally withdrew any and all claims to the woodland parcel, acknowledged that the dormant claim from the Vane maternal estate had been improperly leveraged in the Calloway betrothal negotiation, and agreed to have no further legal dealings with either the Calloway estate or the Vane family, under penalty of full disclosure of the 11-year-old letter to the relevant legal authorities. He signed without significant negotiation. He was, Aldrich reported afterward, a man who knew when a game was over. The Derbyshire magistrate connection was forwarded quietly to the appropriate oversight body. Aldrich had been very thorough. On the evening of the same day, Isolde wrote to her mother. She wrote about the deed, about what had been recovered, about Gerald Ashby, and what he had tried to do. She wrote about the letter of acknowledgement that now existed, naming the history of improper transfers clearly and in legal language. She wrote about Devereux and his mother in the East Library and the conversation that had changed things. She wrote, I came here to recover what belonged to you. I did not expect to find that it was connected to something much larger, or that the man I had tried to use as a vehicle for that recovery had himself been used as a target by someone else. I did not expect to understand him the way I do, or to find that he understood me in return, or to have to sit with the complicated truth that my original purpose and the life I found here were not as separate as I had made them in my mind. I am going to stay. Not because I have been convinced, because I have chosen. That is a different thing, and I need you to know the difference. The second proposal happened on a Tuesday morning in the estate office over a property map. This was extremely characteristic of both of them. Devereux said, I want to make a formal change to the betrothal agreement. Isolde looked up from the map. Which change? All of it, he said. I want to draft a new settlement, one in which your legal standing is explicitly preserved, one in which the properties that are yours remain in your name independently, regardless of the marriage, with no mechanism by which they can be absorbed, transferred, or mortgaged without your signature and full prior knowledge. She set down the pen. She looked at him. He continued, I want a structure in which you are not simply Duchess of Ashford. I want you to be a named co-managing entity of the Ashford estate with independent legal authority over the sectors you have been effectively managing since you arrived here. That is an extraordinary arrangement, she said. Yes, he said. I know a very good solicitor. She almost laughed. She did not, quite. Devereux, she said, are you proposing to me? He looked at her. I am proposing to you very specifically on the basis of a property arrangement, yes, he said, because I thought you might find that more persuasive than flowers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, It is the most persuasive thing anyone has ever said to me. Good, he said. Then I will have Aldrich draw it up. The Derbyshire parcel was transferred to Isolde's name in the second week of August. The documentation was clean and unambiguous, a simple, properly executed deed transfer, witnessed by both solicitors, signed by Devereux without hesitation or modification, recorded with the appropriate registry within the same week. Isolde traveled to Derbyshire to see it. Devereux offered to go with her. She said she needed to go alone the first time. He said, "Yes, of course." She went alone, on a morning with low cloud and the smell of approaching rain, and she stood on the hillside of that 12-acre parcel with its 2 acres of woodland, and its 1 empty cottage, and its long, overgrown pasture. And she thought about her grandmother, whom she had never met, who had owned this ground before any of them. She was there for a long time. When she came back, she brought a handful of heather from the hillside. She put it in a glass on the library windowsill. She did not explain it. Devereux did not ask. He understood. Isolde's mother came to Ashford in September. This was not a planned visit, or it had been planned, but by Constance Calloway in correspondence with the Dowager Countess of Vane, conducted over 3 weeks in letters that neither woman mentioned to anyone. The 2 older women met in the morning room over tea and had a conversation that lasted 4 hours and of which no record exists, though Mrs. Penny noted that more tea was requested than for any other visit she could recall. Devereux and Isolde were in the estate office when they heard the carriages and looked at each other. "Your mother," said Isolde. "My mother has had correspondence," said Devereux. Isolde looked at him. "You knew." "I suspected," he said. "I thought it was their business." "It is their business," she agreed. She thought about it. "They will be fine," she said. "They will terrify each other," he said, "and come out the other side with great mutual respect." He paused. "Like their children." Isolde looked at him. Was that a compliment? "It was an observation," he said, but she could see the corner of his mouth, and she knew him well enough to know what that meant. The letter of acknowledgement, the one that named the history of improper transfers and documented the truth about the woodland parcel and the Vane maternal estate, was delivered to Isolde's mother by Isolde herself on the afternoon of the second day of the visit. They sat together in the yellow morning room. Constance had vacated it tactfully, and Isolde placed the document on the table between them and waited while her mother read it. Her mother's name was Margaret Vane, and she was 57, and she had spent 15 years in the bedroom of a house that was disappearing around her. She read the letter slowly. When she finished, she did not speak for a moment. Then she looked up at her daughter and said, "You did all this." Not a question, a recognition. "Yes," said Isolde. Her mother folded the document carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep. "Your grandmother," she said, "would have liked you enormously." Isolde said nothing. She took her mother's hand. They sat together for a while in the pale morning room light. The legal framework for the new betrothal settlement took 3 weeks to draft and was 42 pages long. Aldrich called it the most comprehensive marital property arrangement he had ever produced. Pemberton, reviewing it on Isolde's behalf, called it unprecedented. Isolde called it a starting point. Devereux called it overdue. The document named Isolde as an independent legal entity with co-management authority over 3 sectors of the Ashford estate, the tenant farms, the household investments, and the northern properties, with explicit provisions ensuring that no transfer of any Vane-originating asset could occur without her countersignature, that all property she brought to the marriage remained registered in her own name, and that an independent annual review would be conducted by a neutral party of her choosing. There was nothing like it in Ashford. There was very little like it anywhere in England. This was discussed at every dinner party in the county for the next 2 months. Constance Calloway attended 3 of these dinner parties and said with great serenity that she thought it was extremely sensible and long overdue. The wedding happened in October, not at St. Marguerite's. Both of them had agreed, without much discussion, that St. Marguerite's belonged to a different story now. They married at Ashford Hall itself, in the estate chapel attached to the east wing, which was older and smaller and smelled of stone and old wood, and was not dressed with 200 roses. It was dressed with heather and late-season wildflowers and the remaining apples from the kitchen garden trees, because Isolde had requested something real, and Devereux had told Mrs. Penny to let her arrange it herself. The guest list was 40 people. Constance sat in the front row in dark green silk. Margaret Vane sat beside her. Cassius stood at the altar with his brother and looked, for the first time in 3 months, entirely uncomplicated. The 2 solicitors were there because Isolde had invited them. which she had, because they had earned it. When Isolde walked into the chapel on her father's arm, she was wearing a dress the color of deep amber, not white, not ivory, nothing that gestured toward a traditional version of the occasion, and her mother's garnet earrings, and her own hair pinned back plainly, and the expression of a woman who has made a decision she has thought about completely and stands behind entirely. Devereux turned when she reached him, and he looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had come to know best in 2 years of knowing him, the one that saw exactly what was there and asked nothing else of it. He said quietly enough that only she could hear, "The deed is signed." She understood him completely. She said, "Good." And then the ceremony began, and Ashford Hall opened its windows to the October air, and the last of the late roses in the garden shook in the afternoon wind, and two people who had spent 2 years finding each other through the longest possible route made at last the simplest possible choice. They stayed. If you enjoyed the story, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are.